Okay, so thank you everyone for joining today. This is continuing a series this year, I think, of particularly good speakers, but I am biased because I did put the schedule together. Hopefully everyone agrees. And if you're used to coming to these, you'll know I don't really introduce the speakers very much because I like to hear what they're currently excited about. But I think it would be wrong for me not to highlight just how incredible it is to have Dorothy in particular here today. You've probably all seen her in the news a lot lately with the Royal Society and Elon Musk stuff. But this is someone who I think quite rarely genuinely, very publicly sticks to sort of her values and doing the right thing, which is often not always the easy thing to do. And I'm really, really excited for this one and to have finally met Dorothy, who I've been following for years now. So I'll
Oh,
hand it over to you, Dorothy.
well, that's very kind of you. And are you seeing actually the full screen slide rather
Yes.
than, yeah, great. Okay. Um, yeah, well, I wasn't going to sort of say much about myself at all, really, except that I've been around for a very long time. I started in research in the 1970s, and I was telling Johnny I've been to many places in the UK, mainly following my husband around doing bits of research. And yeah, I mean, like, the Royal Society thing was strange, really. I can only say that the more you get involved in the establishment, the more the scales fall from your eyes about a lot of these big institutions. And just, I'm very glad not to be in the Royal Society anymore. Let's just put it that way. Um, but anyway, I'm going to talk about my current obsession. I retired in, I think, 2022 after working on children's language disorders for most of my career. And I had been increasingly interested in open science and reproducibility and all those issues and trying to basically improve science. But um, on retirement, I thought I would quite like to tackle fraud, which I saw as a sort of growing problem. And so that's more or less the main thing I'm focusing on these days, insofar as I mean, I'm also behaving like a retired person a lot of the time, which is nice. I'm not working all the time. But anyway, I saw that I started thinking about this around the time that we all were in lockdown because of COVID and so on. And I started to sort of think about how fraudulent behavior is a bit like a virus and how it can get in and be very disruptive. And so that's sort of the theme of this talk. Um, so the thing about fraud is that people tend to think it's, relatively minor problem in science because we were all told that science is self-correcting and everybody thinks fraud is very rare. And I think increasingly in the past, perhaps, certainly 10 years and perhaps even the past 5 years, it's becoming clear that there's much more fraud than I think most people thought. And insofar as people think about fraud, um, I think the traditional view is to think of these so-called bad apples, individuals who might be very high profile and who have then found out to have committed fraud, and it makes a big scandal and everybody talks about it. A couple of examples in psychology, you've got Diederik Stapel, who is unusual for having confessed to being a fraudster once he was found out. And he also unusual in being found out by a very efficient process at his institution that really sorted this issue out quite quickly, that he was just making stuff up. Paolo Macchiarini, who you may also be familiar with, is a very different sort of story where it went on for years that this guy was operating on people supposedly to allow them to grow their own, regrow a trachea after with using stem cell scaffolding. And it turned out that the people that understood about how stem cells work didn't think it was plausible this could work, that he hadn't done the animal studies he should have done, that he was wildly hyping what he'd done and ignoring bad results, which included people dying. So he went on for years. He was very charismatic. And in his case, the people who blew with a whistle on him at the Karolinska Institute were the ones that suffered massively. And still to this day, some of them are having sort of bad outcomes related to the fact that they were whistleblowers. Eventually, people caught up with him, and the chickens came home to roost, and he got sued. But it's a sort of classic bad story about how fraudsters survive. And there's other stories like that. And if you're interested in reading more, this book, The Great Betrayal, is about earlier cases by Horace Judson, and it's quite a nicely written book about a range of cases. But as well as those sorts of cases, what's particularly worrying people now is the sort of more industrial scale fraud that's going on. And people started to write about this. This is 2021. It was picked up by a feature in Nature, that there's these fake paper factories that churn out scam science, as they said it. There were big, large-scale retractions as people suddenly realized that whole loads of fraudulent paper had been injected into certain journals. The US House Committee on Space, Science and Technology in July 2022 actually had a whole session on this where they called expert witnesses because they were getting concerned that the science was getting infected, if you like, with this. So the other thing is that, as the longer it goes on, the more you're seeing these really mass retractions. So in 2023, more than 10,000 research papers retracted, most of these coming from these paper mills. So they would be mass retractions as a publisher would discover a paper mill had got into certain journals, and then you could identify these papers rather rapidly and just sort of get rid of them at scale. But this is sort of very shocking to the publishers and to many of us as well. So how does this work? This guy, Nick Wise, as a graduate student, uncovered a lot of the mechanism of it. So he was looking around on the internet, on Facebook groups, Telegram channels, WhatsApp groups, and he found people overtly selling authorship of papers, selling citations, book chapters, and patents even. And he then reported quite a lot of this to certain publishers, and he's one of the people behind some of these mass retractions. Funnily enough, he's now he now works for one of the publishers as an integrity officer, because obviously he's a very useful person who understands how these things work. But he really uncovered a lot of stuff just by looking on the internet and recognizing that things were not right. He then started up actually a Twitter account called Author for Sale, where he would highlight some of these things. And unfortunately, some people took this seriously and thought he was a paper mill and started suggesting that they'd like to place their papers with him, which is what happens when you get into this world. So paper mills are really rather different from other sorts of fraud because they operate at scale, and instead of individuals being involved, you're talking about hundreds of people involved, both making money out of it and also hundreds of authors contributing papers. And I make a broad distinction here between, although it's a very fuzzy distinction, but there are some paper mill outputs that are very hard to detect because they're very plausible looking. And these are typically created from some sort of template of a proper paper that they start with, and then you sort of tweak bits of it to create a plausible looking paper. And Elizabeth Bick has uncovered quite a lot of cases of that. She's very well known for identifying fraudulent images in papers. But then you get other sorts of things that are frankly nonsensical, that sometimes have very weird language in them, no coherent structure, and probably are written by AI these days, although otherwise maybe by people sort of laboring in some sort of sweatshop, just creating this sort of stuff. And Guillaume Cabanac and Cyril Labé in France were able to sort of get an estimate of these, what they call nonsensical algorithmically generated paper in the scientific literature by looking for markers of these sorts of things. I'll say a bit about more about that in a moment. But you would think these things shouldn't get into the system because we have peer review, and the whole point of peer review is quality control in theory. But what happens in practice is that the article gets published either because it just is a very convincing fake, or because fake reviewers are recommended. So authors can suggest their own reviewers, and if they're not properly checked, the reviewers may turn out to be completely fake. You get also these hijacked journals or predatory journals. So a predatory journal is where you have a journal that's set up with a pure motive of making money out of gullible people, and it's not a proper journal at all. But sometimes you get what was a proper journal, which is hijacked by a bad actor, so that they create a web presence that looks exactly like the original real journal, and then people submit to it unwittingly. The other thing that concerns me greatly is cases where the editor is complicit in the fraud and may just wave through fake papers or allow authors to be added. Now, just this week, there was this very interesting blog post by Shaba Shabo, who's just written a very good book about fraud in biomedical science. And he describes how he was approached by somebody from a paper mill. And this is the scale of pay that they were prepared to give to him. You probably can't read it, but depending on the impact factor of the journal, he could be paid for each paper he managed to place, because he's got the whole correspondence, which is, he did it as a sting operation. So he started asking them questions about how much would I get, what would I need to do, etc., etc. And the higher the impact factor of the journal, the more he got. And if he just accepted things they sent him, he would get a certain amount. If he actually had to write things, he'd get another amount. The whole thing is totally corrupt. And the amazing thing is they clearly didn't check up on him before they contacted him, because he's a famous author of a book about fraud. So you would think, well, unless they're very, very cynical. Um, so the other thing you get, though, are these very convincing fakes from a template. And one of the best examples of these is in cancer genetics, where a whole range of bad papers was discovered almost by accident by this lady, Jennifer Byrne, who was a cancer biologist. She was really just studying a relatively rare gene that rather few people were looking at, and was surprised to suddenly find a little influx of papers all claiming to be about this rare gene. But when she looked at them, they had the wrong sequences of nucleotides. I mean, most people wouldn't notice this because, they're just letters. But of course, since she was studying this gene herself in detail, she was able to pick that up. And she then found that there were also papers that seemed to have this template format. And in effect, what people were doing was starting with one perfectly plausible paper, and then creating loads of clones, which either change the gene or they change the phenotype or both. And there's so many uninvestigated genes out there that you can do this, and you'll always be saying something completely new. You pick a bit of a gene that nobody's ever studied and a phenotype nobody's ever studied with that. And you can generate loads of these things. So she, together with Cyril Labbe, developed this automated search for papers like this, where they just found a mismatch between the sequence of nucleotides and the gene. And they screened 12,000 papers automatically and found 700 with these wrong sequences. And of course, occasionally it could be a genuine error, but there were enough of them that had this sort of formulaic quality that it was clear this was a scam, that somebody had realized this is a very good way to get your paper published, to just make this stuff up. And they then get into meta-analyses. And of course, in this biomedical field, it's quite serious, because a lot of progress in drug development is made by scraping literature for particular genetic sequences and so on, and then sort of pulling in all the information you can get. So if it's contaminated with fraudulent stuff, this is going to hold up drug development. The other thing that you see are these special issues happen suddenly, that in some journals and some publishers in particular, been a massive increase in special issues, where there's reduction of quality control because that they have a guest editor. And some of these publishers, MDPI, Frontiers in particular, are sort of asking online, they're saying, would you like to edit a special issue, and please write in with your suggestion for a special issue. This is fine if, some of us might do that in good faith, but the problem is that you'll get people who see this as an opportunity to place paper mill papers. And if the publisher isn't being very careful about how they select people to do this, it's a real foot in the door for the fraudsters. So that's a real problem. The unconvincing fakes, I got very interested in them because I was looking at some of the work of Guillaume Cabanac, who was picking up on these papers that were nonsensical and had very odd phraseology. And I found that in Hindawi journals, this seemed to be a very common thing, that you would have a weird paper which looked like it was a not very good project by somebody, possibly an undergraduate project of some sort. And it would be on a perfectly sensible topic. But then suddenly in the middle of it, there would be injected a whole section about machine learning and AI, which was made to sound as if it related to this topic. But it would have just formulae lifted from Wikipedia. It would look very sciencey and very mathematical, but it made no sense whatsoever. And the title would be modified to include these mentions of AI and machine learning and such like. And it was just sort of like, as I called them, gobbledygook sandwiches, because they had a beginning and an end that were not good, but were sort of sensible. And then suddenly in the middle of it was this sort of great section that bore no relationship to anything else. Um, and there was one journal at the time, which I think is now shut down, called the Journal of Environmental and Public Health, which virtually every paper in it in 2022 was of this kind, and they were not about environmental or public health. I mean, they were off topic completely. Some of them were about things like, Chinese politics, Marxism, or, transport, and all sorts of strange things. Anyway, so if you want examples of those and you look in PubPeer, I tended to write about them in PubPeer and give them that name, gobbledygook sandwich. This is an example of one of them, which is probably not all readable, but it gives you the flavor of things that are completely crazy. Optimization method of high-speed train composite material workshop planning and scheduling. What the hell does that actually even mean? And it goes all over the place. It is a bit on trains and there's a bit on composite materials, but there's no sort of link between them. It's just crazy stuff. It seems to be, I mean, if it is AI generated, it's not very good AI. It reads more as if it's just somebody crazily perhaps plagiarizing bits from text and changing stuff. And then this is one that is in an area that I do know about. There's a lot of papers like this. They're all trying to predict autism or Parkinsonism or Alzheimer's from some sort of data set that they've got hold of, often an open data set, and claiming again to be using machine learning. But then they've got this weird language. So this one, the crude EEG sign gathered from the scalp of the member are first encouraged into a signal pre-handling module to evacuate exceptions, write EOG and EMG antiquities, and upgrade the sign to commotion proportion. And if you complain about this on social media, some people say, well, this is just, you're being harsh on somebody whose English isn't very good, but you're not, because these are not sort of signs of bad English. They're signs of actually these tortured phrases that Guillaume Cabernac has identified, where somebody's taken an original piece and tried to avoid plagiarism checks by substituting some of the language. So, the raw EEG signals become the crude EEG sign, and removing outliers becomes evacuating exceptions. Artifacts become antiquities, and perhaps the best one is the signal to noise ratio becomes the sign to commotion proportion. I mean, it's wonderful stuff. This is one reason why I had fun doing this. It's a bit, if you like word games, trying to guess what the original was, you can have fun with this. But of course, it's definitely serious that this actually gets into a Springer publication. How did that happen? In fact, I did a little quiz for the audience here. You might, if you haven't seen these before, I'll give you a minute or so to just look at these and see whether you can guess what the originals of these terms are. Most of them are somewhat statistical or technology sort of things. I'm assuming that most people know what the nasty squared blunder is. It's the mean squared error. I just love that one. So, p esteem, p value, ceaseless estimations, continuous recordings, 10 crease, tenfold. I mean, this is just crazy stuff. So this is why you can have fun with tortured phrases, looking for these. They're not all paper mill products don't have these, but there's a certain subset of paper mills that had a lot of these because they were just plagiarizing stuff and then putting it through some AI system that made these changes and then managing to publish it. Does it matter though? Because some people would say, well, okay, this is all in crappy journals. No sensible journal would accept this stuff. It's just low-ranking journals. It's not going to bother people who are doing serious science. And I used to think that a bit. And then I sort of started to realize that, no, this is quite a serious problem, even though a lot of them are in funny, crappy journals. And I would say there is a number of victims here of scientific fraud. You've got people who are trying to build on the research, and you might say, well, you just reject these papers as clearly mad. But if you're, say, trying to do a systematic review and you're interested in, I don't know, prediction of or diagnosis of autism, that strange paper would turn up and you'd have to screen it, and you'd probably fairly rapidly decide it was rubbish. But it just clogs you down. If there's a lot of this stuff and you're trying to quickly screen a whole load of papers, having And people doing systematic reviews are increasingly complaining that as many as 25%, 30% of the papers that they pull out when they do a search on keywords are fraudulent. And some of them are easier to spot than others. So that is an issue. Then you've got the problem of people who get ahead because they do this stuff. That's why people do this, because it's going to promote their careers. And if you're in a system where you're evaluated largely in terms of the number of your publications and people don't actually read them, you can actually do rather well. And you find that some of these people who've had these paper mill publications are now in positions of some consequence in institutions, all around the world. This then has the effect that they will be picked up as very useful people to be editors and peer reviewers by publishers and journals who are very keen not to just be only using white Western people as editors and reviewers. So they will be delighted to find somebody in Iran or somebody in Russia or somebody in India with a nice publication record, lots of publications in this field, and they will think this is the perfect person to have as an editor to represent the global south or wherever. So this is clearly happening because you find that these people then get into editorial and certainly peer review positions. The journals themselves and the publishers will actually often portray themselves as victims in some way. My argument is they're not doing nearly enough to counteract this, but certainly they have been burned by this and had some reputational damage to the extent that the Hindawi publishing brand, which is a subset of Wiley, was required that they actually ended up shutting down because they were so infested with this that their name became mud and they became untenable and financially not viable because the shareholders are getting nervous. So that is bad for them. Public trust in science will get damaged by this, of course. If people start seeing that this sort of rubbish is in the literature, they'll say, well, how do we know what to trust? People using paper mills could be regarded as victims because some of them are just very naive and they feel I've got to publish to get ahead. I need a publication to continue in my job. So they think I'll pay a few £1,000 to get this publication. And then, of course, the paper gets retracted and they don't get their money back. So you could argue that they're victims in a sense. And then non-academic users of research. I'm getting increasingly concerned of the way paper millers are injecting into the literature a lot of pseudoscience. So if somebody comes to me and says, here's this treatment for autism, do you think it's any good? And I used to say, is there any peer-reviewed literature on it? And typically there wasn't if it was something dodgy. But these days there's tons of peer-reviewed literature. It's all from paper mills. But, so it becomes harder and harder to give people criteria by which you can judge what is actual pseudoscience and what is good stuff. So I think it's a big problem. I want to just give you one example as well of how a paper mill can infest what looks like a perfectly decent journal. It's not just these sort of very weird things that are nearly sort of predatory. So this was a little experience I had with Anna Abalkina. So she's an economist who is an expert on hijacked journals and particularly East European ones. But she noticed that one way of identifying paper mills was that the authors would use fake email addresses. They would have an email domain that was just purchased and didn't really correspond to anything. And so she could search then, and this tanu.pro was such a domain. So if you search for authors who have that domain as their email address, you then find all the paper mill stuff comes up. And she wanted to check that she was sort of double checking whether these were illegitimate and found some psychology papers and we were sort of communicating on a Slack channel. And she said, would anybody look at these? And I thought that's my field, I'll have a look. And it was very interesting because I was quite surprised. They were in the Journal of Community Psychology, which is not a sort of high impact journal, but it's a perfectly reputable Wiley journal, long history, founded in 1973. The editor looked entirely fine. He was a sort of well-established psychiatrist with a good publication record called Michael Blank. So this really, surprised me. Why was this stuff getting into these journals? But it certainly was strange stuff. This article was very hard to understand what exactly it was saying. And this is true of a lot of these East European paper mill products. They are just sort of a lot of verbiage. They're often not even presented as an empirical paper, but they're more sort of like thought pieces, only you can't get a real sense of what exactly they're saying. They just sort of ramble on. This one also is got a slightly negative political overtones about protesters being bad people. The thing about it that immediately makes you aware there's a problem is that the corresponding author, who claims to come from Kazakhstan, has got this weird email address that ends in .uoel.uk, which sounds like the University of East London, but it isn't. It's a purchased email domain, and why should somebody from Kazakhstan have that domain? Then, fortunately for us, these papers, I think nearly all of them, in 5 of the 6 papers, had open peer review, so you could see what the state of the peer review was, and it was not like any peer review I'd ever seen before. It was, I mean, subsequently I've seen a lot of peer review like this, and it's got a hallmark of probably being AI generated. Very, very vague, doesn't engage with the topic, broadly positive, and then comes up with little phrases like, the literature should be refreshed since some of the citations are considered rather dating. This person, Georgina Smith from the University of the Sunshine Coast, the University of the Sunshine Coast, which sounds lovely, does exist, but she is not listed as being at it. Heaven knows whether she ever was. She's probably doesn't exist at all, and has never published anything. But she has one review, and then that's responded to, and then another review saying this is absolutely fine. And this is this sort of gobbledygook nonsense. And the second reviewer, very similarly, somebody who doesn't seem to actually exist, and then says, the author used many figures and tables, which is certainly useful for readers. I mean, for heaven's sake, who says that? I mean, it's just crazy stuff. Some of the inscriptions on the figures are difficult to read. Please improve their quality. And then this is very common. It is necessary to revise the conclusion section, describe more clearly the obtained result. I mean, this is very vague. It doesn't engage with the topic at all. And then again is asking for the references to be refreshed. Unusual word used in both these peer reviews, which both happen to come in on exactly the same day. So this is made up stuff. So the question is, how did this happen? So I'm sitting there thinking, my first hypothesis was that maybe this is an editor who's sick or old or lost the will to live in some sense, and has perhaps just delegated this all to a secretary and doesn't read the papers, but just says, well, get some reviews, and if they're positive, we'll accept it, without really reading anything. But then I thought, well, if that's what he's doing, we could try a sting operation where we submit a paper about the paper mill. And if he's not reading papers, he might accept it, which would be rather fun. But this didn't actually work because he immediately rejected our paper and said it was a trivial paper on only 6 cases. And of course, at that point, you think, no, he's complicit. He must be knowing what he's accepting those other papers, and he's rejecting ours, which is actually damn sight more scholarly than these things he's accepted. So it seemed that something was seriously wrong. So what we did was to immediately just post our paper as a preprint, open access, and subsequently, in fact, we've published it. But we also reported this case to the integrity officer at Wiley, and although it took a while, all the papers were then retracted because it was clearly evident that something had gone wrong. And of course, what the publisher themselves has got the whole list of that they can really trace all the correspondence and have more information than we had. But we felt we had easily enough that the authors' emails were all wrong, the peer review was crazy, the papers are crazy. So that's the sort of thing that you can get happening. And the paper mills will try to target higher impact journals if they possibly can. And they will sometimes have things that look a lot more believable than these papers did. The more high impact journals they can get into, the more they can charge, basically. So the scary thing is that we're picking up the things that are obviously flawed, but we suspect that there's a lot of things that are much harder to detect that are out there, which is a frightening thought. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. As I said, the publishers, they tend to portray themselves as victims of these paper mills. And some of the big name publishers are affected. I think probably all of the big name publishers are affected to greater or lesser extent. Hindawi was really a very bad case. There's some evidence that MDPI has quite a lot of this, certainly a lot of odd peer review that doesn't seem to be proper peer review. Springer Nature has instances, Elsevier has instances. And they got to the point where they realized they had a problem. And there was a very good report by the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, and the Society, I can't remember what STM stands for, but it's an organization about scientific publishing. So they got together and wrote a very good report back in, I think that was about 2022, 2023, documenting the problem and saying more needed to be done. Um, and they focused on training of editors and reviewers to spot this stuff. And they also initiated some mass retractions. And now they're trying to develop criteria to detect paper mill products. And the publishers are getting together, which is why this movement or this organization is called United to Act. They're trying to develop criteria. But my feeling is they're not necessarily focusing in the right place because they're not really focusing on editors, who I see from my experience with this Journal of Community Psychology. I feel the editor is the gatekeeper, and if they're letting in clearly nonsensical stuff, there's something seriously wrong. And if you talk to publishers, they will say, well, or if you tell them about cases like this, they often will reply saying, well, we're going to give them some more education. I mean, I think if you're doing this sort of stuff, you don't need education. You need to be kicked out. I mean, it's quite simple. Also, I mean, they have massive conflict of interest, some more than others, but this is an example from Hindawi. So if you look at these graphs, they're all showing you the number of papers that are published in the journals, in four of these journals from Hindawi. And you see this dramatic rise between 2021 and 2022, which is almost totally from special issues. So they suddenly discovered the special issue as a way to, boost the submissions to the journal. And if you multiply the article processing charges by the number of papers, you can see that this meant that I think this was just 2022, suddenly the income from these journals was skyrocketing. I mean, the computational intelligence and neuroscience, 8 million from just one journal in 1 year in dollars. And, the others also, this is just 4 out of a number of journals they've got where you see this sort of phenomenon. So I did this analysis. I have never properly published it, but it's out there on SciArchive. And I started to think this is really a disincentive for the journals to tackle this properly. I mean, for them, it's sort of balancing making money on the one hand and then sort of getting their reputation tarnished on the other, and they're trying to balance that. But I think the pressures for getting rid of paper mills are not perhaps as high as you might think. So what can we do? As I've said, there's a sort of virus model of paper mill management, which I thought of parallels that you want to test and trace, you want to inoculate against it, you want to quarantine those who are affected. Testing and tracing, I would say open science plays a big role in helping with this. Jennifer Burns suggested if in cancer genetics people would pre-register their studies, you could shut down paper mills. And you might say, well, you could invent a pre-registration. The problem is that cancer genetic studies take a couple of years to do. So you couldn't just sort of do a pre-registration and then report the paper. You'd have to wait 2 years, and the paper millers are impatient. So that would help slow things down. But she says the community in cancer genetics are reluctant to go for pre-registration. So, you've still got the problem. But open access is great. It makes it easier to check articles, and especially if you're exploring a network. Open data and open code, that's harder to fake. You can fake everything, but it just makes work harder for the fraudsters if they have to provide that as well as a paper. Open peer review, as I've illustrated, that really helps. Open post-publication peer review, which is particularly done with PubPeer, has been a very good source for identifying patterns of people who regularly publish this sort of stuff. And I found here in the analysis I did of Hindawi articles, what I'm showing you here are papers that are either just regular papers, or they're in a special issue but don't have a PubPeer comment against them, or they're in a special issue with a PubPeer comment. And for these special issue papers, all the PubPeer comments are just documenting either gobbledygook or other strange things like that. There's no positive ones. And you can see that the ones that have got pub peer comments and are in special issues are accepted remarkably fast. Their turnaround time is really fast, and the editors of those special issues are also accepting huge numbers of papers. So, there's clearly evidence from this. It's indirect evidence, but it's evidence that this is what's going on, and you can start to identify who are the problematic editors. The problem is if you're going to do all these things and sort of do all these checks, the people who are currently doing things like writing public comments are doing it just, for the love of it or because they're crazy and obsessive people. Nobody seems to be, the publishers themselves don't seem to be putting much effort, although they keep saying they're putting more effort into this, but they're not being very proactive about tackling this. Inoculation, I think, does relate to the perverse incentive structure. So if hiring and firing and grants depend on publications and citations, this is a rather fuzzy quote from Joe Simmons, but he captures it perfectly. And he said, if you had a world in which some scientists cheat and some don't, the cheaters can't and don't get caught because nobody checks. Who's more likely to get the papers, the jobs, the editorial positions, the cheaters or the non-cheaters? Who's more likely to have to quit? And it's clear the cheaters will succeed, the non-cheaters will quit. That's really a serious problem. And then I've got a reference here also to this Edwards and Roy paper about it in a more formal way. And you've got these various variations in how these criteria are applied. But certainly I was shocked when I was on a committee for accepting people onto an MSc in neuroscience in Oxford, the number of people who in their undergraduate degree had a publication and that was considered a positive thing. In my day, you didn't necessarily have any publications coming out of your PhD. I mean, I'm that old. And we used to all say, oh, this is China, where there's this requirement for publications in order for medical candidates to move forward in their career. I've recently discovered it's just as bad in the UK. There's a point system where first authored publication gets you a long way if you're going for a specialist registry. So these incentives are baked in and they're not helpful. So what you'd need to do is to remove them, stop using these proxy publication metrics, and reward integrity rather than the number of publications. For example, ask job applicants to list their 4 best papers rather than all their papers, promote open science, and explicitly value and reward those researchers who expose research fraud. And the publishers just need to slow down and stop this explosion in new journals and particularly special issues and promote open science, including pre-registration. Then quarantine is the last thing. I've put permanent. I mean, I'm of a firm belief that you don't need to, you're not doing anything that bad by telling somebody they can't be an editor anymore. It's not like losing your job, but they should really be got rid of if they are using journals for self-promotion or taking bribes. Retracting of paper mill products very promptly. It's been very slow in the past. I think they're now realizing they have to speed up. Open peer review will help and work with PubPeer to identify problems early. And the institutions need to really stop brushing things under the carpet when somebody's revealed to have these problems. They're often very reluctant to deal with misconduct cases, especially if they're from academics bringing in grants. They're worried about reputational costs and legal challenges, but my view is that the reputational costs are much worse if you don't deal with this. And I think we need a body to deal with this more. So I'm trying to end on a positive note by saying there are things we can do, but my goodness, there is an awful lot that needs doing. And I think we need to start taking this as very seriously because I think it is a massive problem, even though it might not be thought to be one. But anyway, I'm happy to leave the rest of the time for questions.
Thank you. If anyone does have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or use the raise hand function. I actually, just because of where you ended there, I was meant last year to write an article with Nick about arguing for the setting up of like an independent body to regulate academia and these kind of problems. So I
Yeah.
should probably get back on that.
Well, I should say that, of course, the other thing there is that you say we all thought that would be great, and who would do it though? I mean, is it going to be independent? Because, of course, what we're seeing now in the States is you really wouldn't want government doing this. It's an object lesson to all of us that if you had Donald Trump deciding what was good science and what was bad science, or indeed Nigel Farage, should he get in, that would be rather serious.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the current situation in the US. On the US, I think this is a good question this is a good point for one of the questions I had. We seem to be seeing, and it's not just the US, places like Hungary have been doing this longer actually, but there's a weaponization of the kind of stuff we do. So trying to argue for better scientific practices,
Yeah,
changing publishing, highlighting some of the problems with publishing. The admin in the US in particular are really using that to weaponize their attacks on science. So RFK Jr., for example, uses the reproducibility crisis
yeah,
constantly as a
yeah.
justification for destroying science. When that's going on, one of the things I've seen across social media is some scientists and some people within the space have started to sort of attack each other and say, well, you shouldn't be pointing out all these problems because you're
I,
fueling them, right?
yeah.
So I mean, where do you, I'm very clear where I stand on that, but how do you think we should try to deal with that new problem?
Yeah. I mean, I think we just have to do two things. We have to continue to attack the bad stuff. I mean, I think that's the only, I mean, there's no way we should keep quiet about it because then confidence in us is not justified. People say, oh, you're destroying trust in science. Well, there shouldn't be trust in science. There's all this terrible stuff. So we need to be very firm about tackling it promptly and efficiently and being seen to tackle it and to clean up our own act. But also we need to be pointing out the serious errors in the logic of people like, JFK. I mean, it's JFK. I shouldn't call him JFK, but Robert Kennedy Jr. I mean, his ideas for how to do a trial, for example, are at odds both, logically, methodologically, and ethically with anything that anybody else would say. So we need to be very clear that we're going to show that we understand what good standards are, even though some of the people that we work with are not adhering to them. But I think you just have to stand up for very high standards, and this is why I was rather disappointed in the thing with the Royal Society that I felt they had an opportunity there to say, right, we're not going to identify ourselves at all with the sort of stuff that Musk is saying and doing because it's misinformation. But they wouldn't. So I think one has to push, but I don't think capitulating and just saying, well, it can be weaponized, therefore we shouldn't do it is the answer. I think it's a really tough issue, though.
Yeah, I agree. It's a question, well, two questions from Cami. Uh, how do you think those of us in the industry could move toward and support the creation of a body to enforce or improve a lot of these things? Um, Government might not be the best operator to do this, so who would be?
Yeah. Well, I think, in theory, maybe academic bodies like the Royal Society or NAS or something, but unfortunately, I mean, they're not stepping up to the plate. But I think you could have somebody completely independent. I mean, you could have somebody treating it as a business and coming in and saying, we will do this. This is happening with ethics approvals, I know, in some countries that, it's such a lot of work getting your work approved that there's companies that will be set up to do it. And in theory, you could do that, but I think the potential for corruption would be so great that it wouldn't be feasible. I mean, we tried through government various people. I mean, I was asked to report on to a select committee on this, and there did seem to be the idea that through them there might be an independent organization that had some funding from government that would do this. But the organization that was set up, the Committee on Research Integrity, was then sort of pulled away from having any regulatory powers. So it's now just an advisory body and is not in a position to really tell people what to do. So I think we have a huge gap. I don't think there's any organization currently existing that for whom this is their role. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I would think it would come more from academic bodies rather than from either government or from publishers or from, I don't know, private individuals.
Yeah, I think the other thing we often forget is just how much lobbying power the publishing industry and all these things we're up against actually have
Yeah,
compared to movements like this where we don't really have we don't really have the money to do that. And also a lot of us like non-profits are not really allowed to do that kind of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so Cami's other question is in relation to open peer review having sort of a big impact here. What are your thoughts on making this peer review model more prevalent? What you see as the barriers and major blockers? And just before you answer, I want to add a little bit more on that. So I'm currently, there's a piece should be coming out at some point soon where I'm making an argument that we should actually be moving away from peer review and more towards a much broader model of trust markers in research. So peer review would be one of those markers, open peer review, but we really need to start taking in way more different things into account when we're trying to assess a bit of research for how much you can trust it. But what are your thoughts around sort of the open peer review model?
Yeah, well, open peer review, I think what has been conflated in the past is the idea that if it's open, everything's open. I think it can be open without you naming the reviewer. So there are some people who say, well, otherwise the reviewer might have somebody who, their own work then comes up for review from a big important person whose paper they've trashed. So, they're scared to put their name to it. So I think you don't need to have the name. I think it helps to have the name. And I think actually if your name is on an open peer review and it's a very good peer review, it can be to your credit. But if people are scared of that, I think that it's more important that you see what was written to see whether this work was adequately evaluated. And I think that should become absolutely standard. I see no reason not to do that. Um, in terms of whether I think trust markers potentially good, but I'm quite old-fashioned. I do believe in peer review. I mean, I think it's partly that in the old days, it gets so old. The old days when you sort of used to write a paper, submit it to a sensible journal with a sensible editor and proper peer reviewers, it was it wasn't always a positive process, but I got a lot of my papers were greatly improved by having thorough peer review from an expert in the field. That unfortunately, is harder to come by these days. But I think there are things that only a human with expertise, domain-specific expertise, could pick up. And I'm very worried by the idea of, we can give it all over to AI. I think that's a terrible idea. I mean, you could have some trust markers from AI. Maybe that wouldn't do any harm, but I'm quite concerned that there are people who seriously seem to think that you could evaluate academic articles using AI. I think that would really just make matters 100 times worse.
Yeah, I've seen a few of those AI reviews. So Michael is asking, so much of your talk is focused on outright fraud, but there are other more subtle issues that undermine science. So, questionable research practices like
Yeah.
p-hacking and stuff. Um, do you have an estimate on the proportion of research papers that could be considered trustworthy? And by that, he means that there's no funny business at all. So there's no questionable research practice. I reckon that's quite low. Maybe I'm cynical.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's questionable research practice. The problem with it, I think it is hugely variable, discipline to discipline. In psychology, I think we got aware of it, and certainly when I was starting out, I would say p-hacking, harking, and that sort of stuff was normative. Everybody thought this is what you do, and in fact, there were people like Bem writing books, guidance for the young scientists, which were telling them to do exactly those things. I think now it's recognized that this is a problem and people are more nervous about doing it. But a lot of people really do not understand the basics of probability and why this absolutely screws up, your evidence base. So I think a lot of it still goes on, but I think it's far, far worse in a lot of biomedicine where people are doing stuff with, and they are really not aware. I mean, I'm very interested in talking to people from different disciplines. Everybody has their own sort of type of problems that I mean, things like image manipulation, I think, is a bit like in some of the biomedical things, is a bit like p-hacking in psychology, whereas people have been doing it without really realizing that you should not be doing this. You should not be taking your image and cleaning it up and moving out the bits that don't look good. So some of the people who are now being found out to have been doing that get really upset and say, yes, but we were all doing it. It was entirely normal. If you remove all of that stuff, I mean, I think the percentage of really trustworthy stuff is extremely low. I wouldn't like to try and put a number on it, but I think, you've got a lot of fraud, but you've got tons more stuff that's just where people have just massaged data to, get it into some sort of publishable shape.
My background is immunology and microscopy, and I can tell you there's a lot of stuff goes on to pick the right, nice, pretty image. So
Yes.
I really don't
Yeah.
trust much image-based stuff. I
Yeah.
think Katie, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the talk, Dorothy. My question was about the role of preprints in this whole sort of ecosystem. So it strikes me that a lot of the stuff that you were talking about with sort of incentives and the way that journals have reacted and so on, a lot of that has to do with the journal publishing system itself. But sort of ironically, one of the critiques that people levy against the use of preprints more broadly is that they're the untrustworthy things, right? Like they haven't been vetted, and so there's problems with the preprint literature. So I mean, obviously, I don't think that's true, but I was sort of curious how you see these issues of sort of like large scale fraud, either playing into the preprint ecosystem or not? Like, do you see those as separate issues? Like, are preprints part of the solution, or what? How do you see them playing in?
I think the fraudsters are not so interested in pre-printing stuff because it doesn't have the kudos and it's not regarded as such good evidence. So I think bizarrely, in some ways, preprints might be more reliable than published papers, just because frauds. Why would a fraudster bother to produce a preprint? I mean, maybe that will change as preprints become more respectable. I myself am a great believer in preprints, but I like the sort of publishing model. So Wellcome Trust tried very hard to introduce this model where you initially just submit your paper and the quality control is supposed to be that you were funded by Wellcome Trust. So think of that what you will, but certainly it just doesn't mean some random person could just publish something. It's then published without any peer review or anything, but it's not. It's got a sort of stamp on it. It's effectively a preprint, and then reviewers are suggested, and then you can see the whole evolution of the document, and all the peer reviews open, every stage of the process is open. And I was encouraged because I was funded by Wellcome Trust to use that model, and I did quite a lot. But I'm surprised it hasn't really taken off. I think not a lot of people don't like it because you've got so many different versions. I think it works pretty well, but it doesn't have the kudos everybody still wants to publish. I mean, I think a lot of the problems are coming from the reluctance to give up on the journals with the sort of high impact factors, which people then feel they can sort of succeed by showing that they've published their people are very, very reluctant to give up that sort of drug, if you like.
And Martin?
Yeah, really interesting talk. Thanks, Dorothy. I have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to maybe pick up on the point around AI reviewing. I agree, kind of artificial intelligence is not the way to go, but I think so. So reviewing and editing is a very human process, and reviewers can just miss things. And I wonder whether there is a role for automated checks of certain things. I know there are people who've written tools to, for example, just check for p hacking in papers, whether you can kind of complement the human reviewers, which I agree are absolutely vital for their kind of human input, with maybe something which will check things. I mean, we already do it for plagiarism, right? We don't expect reviewers to pick up plagiarism, use
Yeah,
authenticate instead, where there's some specific aspects where which aren't being kind of exploited at the moment, but could be used to maybe help the editors make their decision and pick out really dodgy
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sounds entirely reasonable. In terms of people like the paper mills, of course, what they will always do is once they know that you're doing that, they will devise methods to sort of get around it. And of course, the worrying thing is that a paper mill paper, they could produce something that passed all those checks if they were intelligent enough, because they could write the perfect paper and it would just look wonderful. And it would not have any problems with it. Now, whether anybody else could pick that up, I don't know. But my bet is that the person who might then pick that up would be the human peer reviewer, who would pick out that this might be just too good to be true. I mean, if somebody, I mean, I've got a case at the moment of somebody who's seems to be absolutely fraudulent, but very clever at being fraudulent, and has a whole succession of papers, all of which, get results that are incredibly wonderful. And that in itself makes you think this is a problem. But you couldn't really say that the statistics were wrong or that there was p hacking or any of those things. So but I wouldn't disagree that the more tools you have to do those sorts of automated checks, the better. But I think if you started relying on them, you'd be in trouble.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that statement. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
Okay, we are spot on time, so we're going to finish questions and draw to a close there. Thank you so much again, Dorothy, for a really interesting talk. There was a question earlier on about if this would be available afterwards. This will be on YouTube, I think Friday. I'm in like back-to-back meetings tomorrow, so probably Friday. Otherwise, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been great. All the best then.